Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Deltarune theory. I did not see this coming when I was making this video. Sometimes when you're making a theory, what'll happen is you'll have one direction you're thinking of going, but as you start going over the evidence, you start to see something that is even bigger than what you thought. And that has happened to me before in theories, but never quite to this level. Interestingly, this theory is going to pull from not only my own education in psychology, and also the elective of philosophy I took once. Don't get intimidated, I promise I'm going to explain it very easily for you. But it also draws from my very first theory that I posted, which is the connotations theory. And in fact, this is going to pretty much supplant it entirely. The only thing that video is going to be useful for now will be the list of what every darkener seems to be referencing in terms of connotations, but I will put that in the description of this video if you have not watched that video, and I'm going to summarize it. That said, these are the two videos I'm going to be referencing most in this. Turns out, excuse me, I don't know if you saw that, but the thing flashed back again. I love Google Slides. It loves to work. The two videos we're going to be referencing are the origin of darkeners, which was the first theory I ever made, and the determination original analysis for Deltarune, which is kind of unfortunate, but the exact parts I need don't come up in the Redux, where I use the actual translation book lore to kind of more finely look over the subject. It's not the worst thing, but again, I'm going to summarize it. You don't need to watch this video, but if you find yourself wanting to know more after watching this, these are two places you can go. Speaking of, let me just make myself quite clear so that nobody ends up watching a video they don't want to watch. This is going to be essentially a PowerPoint presentation, so you don't have to be watching the screen the whole time. I will summarize basically what's on the PowerPoint slides. The only reason you would want to watch the slides intently is if you want to see the memes and then, you know, the slight bit of work that I put into it. If there is anything on the slide that I really want you to look at, I will tell you sonically, I guess. I will just tell you to look at the screen. So if you got some laundry to do, this is a great chance to do it. But without further ado, let us begin. This is about dreams. It's all about dreams. I noticed when looking at Deltarune that the concept of dreams comes up quite a lot, but I never really thought it was enough to make a theory about it because it's such a nebulous sort of concept. My mind was changed when I saw a certain comment, which will be on the next slide, but just to sort of set our base together, why are dreams important to Deltarune? Here's some examples of Toby potentially hinting at the importance of dreams in Deltarune. And it starts with the classic interview about how long Deltarune has been in sort of cerebral development, if you want to say that. Like, not physically being developed, but Toby's had the idea in his head. Where Toby says that in 2011, I'm just quoting from the article, by the way. When I was away at school, I got very sick. I ended up having a terrible fever and couldn't get any medicine for it. And while I was sleeping, I had a vivid dream about the ending to a game. Since then, I felt like I had to make a game with that ending. I attempted to make that game in 2012 using character designs by an artist I really like called Canotines. I don't know if I'm saying that right, by the way. I'm assuming that would be how you say it, but... However, I stopped making it even before a single room of the game was finished. But, interestingly, this tweet was brought up in a Reddit post that I saw. In 2011, so the same year Toby had this dream, he tweeted, "The edge of the shadow, where reality and dream meet." And that doesn't really have anything to do with Undertale, and this is in 2011, which is before Undertale has even released. At this point, I think the biggest thing Toby would be known for is music and Homestuck. So it seems very likely that this tweet is meant to reference Deltarune. And putting that all together, there's some sort of aspect of dreams that is going to be important. Even if it is just the ending, which is literally a dream that Toby had, then there is some semblance of dreams being important to the story in the story. Also, little side note, the main family, so Toriel, Asgore, Chris, Kara, Asriel. Their last name has always been Dreamer, which kind of just has the sort of vibe of it being like, oh, they're a main character who's going to change the fate of the world. But it is also literally Dream. So that's another thing to be looking out for. Now, this was the comment I was talking about that got me thinking about this. Because, and I don't know how to say this either, I'm going to guess it's Voliano, but it could be Volian 0, I don't know. But they commented about the last dream on my the Deltarune determination video, stating that its essential check dialogue is the goal of determination. And that's it. Last dream is the goal of determination. And then when you use it, it says, through determination, the dream became true, which is also important. And they go on to have their own speculation. But I do think it's interesting because we've always had hopes and dreams as a sort of phrase in these games. The final battle where the last dream comes from, the main song of that battle is called Hopes and Dreams. And in the legend, which we get in Deltarune, we have, it was a legend of hope, it was a legend of dreams. Plus there's the Field of Hopes and Dreams, which is another song in Deltarune. Really feels like we're trying to nail that in. In Undertale, it was a lot about hope. It was about the hope of the monsters trying to stay alive in the underground, even though things were going badly. Like, they smiled so that they could keep hope. They stuck little crystals in the ceiling so they could have their wishing stars, even though they couldn't see the sky anymore. Asgore was the last hope of the monsters. Not a lot about dreams. So it's interesting that these games that are kind of like not a duology necessarily, and they're not really a sequel, but they are related in this way, almost parallels. You have hopes and dreams. And as the legend goes on, it is a legend of hopes and dreams. It is a legend of light and dark, which Deltarune is definitely a legend of dark. And you could make a lot of points about Undertale perhaps being a adventure based around light. It's the light only you can see for the save points and stuff like that. Something to keep in mind. So, the main bulk of the research for this video was me going to the Deltarune dialogue dump and just typing in dream and copying down every instance of a character saying the word dream. And this is a tally of which characters say dream the most. So, Noelle is at the top of the list, saying it 14 times. Susie 7 times in second place. In third place is a tie with Chris, Swatch, Queen, and Birdley all saying it 3 times. Next up is Ralsei, not really, but we'll get there. And Rudin, again, not really, but we'll get there, which say it twice. We have Gerson, Temmie, Mouse, Ice-E, Jevil, and an unused dialogue box, each saying it once in the final place. So let's go over what these actually are. So Noelle says it the most, but her, what she's saying doesn't have that much content for us to really go over. Basically, the reason why she says dream the most is because she's in both routes of Chapter 2, and everybody is telling her that the Dark World is a dream. That is important, though. Keep that in mind. So we have lines, mostly with Susie, like, right, if you're here, it must be a dream. Or, everything got so intense, I forgot it was a dream. I don't think there's a single line I can pick out here that is particularly important, but comparing the Dark World to a dream will be important later. Next is Susie, and guess what? It's the exact same situation, because it's mostly Susie talking to Noelle and saying, oh, it's just a dream. The only one that's of slight note is the final quote I have here, which says, like, that wasn't a dream or anything, was it? Which is what Susie says when you wake up out of the Dark World in Chapter 1. So her first thought was that maybe that was a dream. It's more just saying the Dark Worlds are kind of like dreams. Next up, we have our Chris, Swatch, Queen, and Birdley section. So Chris has 3 instances of saying dream. Keep dreaming. This is kind of an interesting one, because they say it to Ralsei immediately when Ralsei asks Susie and Chris to join him and do the whole prophecy thing. The answers are, I'll be your servant, or keep dreaming. just a little interesting, given that Ralsei is sort of the prince of the dark world, as far as we can sort of gather. And the other two are talking to Noelle in the Snowgrave route, saying, in your dream, I stole your watch, and because it wasn't a dream, how do you have my watch? So that's a little bit less important, but again, saying the dark world is not a dream this time. Interesting. Swatch is next. Swatch has dialogue about dreams, specifically in relation to Spampton and the Neo body, which is something we're going to have to keep in mind. Swatch says, that robot was the embodiment of a Lightner's dream, a dream that I helped create once. And then in reference to Spampton stealing it, he thought he could use its power to fulfill his own twisted dreams. We will come back to that. Queen, into a darker, darker dream. This is a line that a lot of people have picked up on, because obviously it has that sort of Gaster tone of darker, darker, yet darker. And this is said in the Snowgrave route about Noelle having to fall asleep into a darker, yet darker dream. Yep, keep that in mind too. Her other line is in the Giga Queen fight. She says to, I think, Susie or Chris, to create the world of your dreams, also my dreams. Or my dream. I don't, weird grammar, but that's Queen for you. Create the world of your dreams in relation to making more dark worlds. Yep, keep that in mind. And then Birdley's are kind of nothing. He's saying, huh? A dream? That was all a dream? Oh, of course, it must have been a dream. In reference to waking up out of the dark world. Not super important. Finally, oh, not finally, we have two more. Ignore me. We have Ralsei kind of and Rudin kind of. So the reason why it's Rudin kind of is because it's more about Castletown. And the reason why it's Ralsei kind of is because Ralsei doesn't actually say these lines, but they are about him, kind of. So the first line that Ralsei says that contains dreams is from the legend. It says, it was a legend of hope, it was a legend of dreams. We've already talked about why that might be important. The second line is about the bed that Ralsei has prepared in Chris's room, if you get the bed inspector perk. Perk? Is that the right way to say that? Title? I don't know. It says, it feels incredibly soft, like sleeping on a dream. So this is technically a line from Chris, but this is Chris describing something that Ralsei has made for them. So it's kind of a Ralsei-related thing. It is interesting that one of Ralsei's creations is described as being like a dream, though it could also just be Toby using a commonly known phrase, like sleeping on a dream. I've heard it before, so I'm not surprised. The Rudin Castletown one is a lot more interesting. The Rudin, he's in front of Party Dojo in the Castletown. He says, this is a dream that grows with love and care. Don't be afraid to dream. So this is once again a character literally calling a dark world a dream. He's saying that this, the Castletown, is a dream that grows with love and care. So don't be afraid to dream. That's some pretty strong evidence. Anyway. Moving on to the final group, and I have Jevil at the top, but we are not starting with him. Let's start with the ones that are probably the least important, which is Temmie. Temmie says, Tem get smart, go to Colleg, achieve dream. I'm pretty sure this is taken almost directly from Undertale, and probably doesn't have any significance, considering it's Temmie, who's basically a joke character. Mao's also has a line, I think it's Mao's, it could also be Task, but I'm pretty sure it's Mao's, in the cafe or something. It's in its like check settings, where it says, it dreams of reenacting scenes from cat and mouse cartoons. Probably not important, it's just a reference. Slightly more important on the scale, we have an unused dialogue box, which I couldn't find where exactly this comes from. I know there are a few actual unused like test rooms in the game, but I don't think this is from one of those. I think this is just like random extra dialogue. Not like the dialogue that you're supposed to find as like a, not a debugger, what's it called? Code depiler. Like the whole person lost in the code or the gash weaves down as if you cry. Which, if you don't know what those are, look up Deltarune secret code stuff. But this is more so just like one of those more obscure lines that seems like it was maybe used for testing. Anyway, what it says is, felt like I was soaring through the air earlier. Was that a dream? Probably not important. But given that it is in the unused dialogue, and that is often related to Gastery stuff, I put it a little bit of a step above Temmie and Mouse. Another dubiously important quote comes from an icy magazine in Sans' shop, where if you read the magazine it says, hot and fresh chiaz, pepperoni, just like in your dreams. Icy comes up like a weird amount in Deltarune. Like he was in literally one screen of Undertale, just on the little crossword that Sans gives you. So I think it is something to keep in mind that I'm actually going to touch on later. I can't believe I'm saying that. Icy is relevant, apparently. And then the two that are actually important, that only say dream once, is Gerson. This is on the bench. I love to bring this up. I just think it's important. It's so ominously just there. It feels very important. Anyway, Gerson says, throughout my career, some of my best ideas came from dreams. And then he continues to say something like, so if you're sleeping here, tell people you're writing. We know Gerson was an author in this world, because he wrote the Lord of the Hammer series, something like that, Alvin says. That series being potentially drawn from dreams, like the ideas drawn from dreams, could be quite relevant, especially if, and it seems like Gerson is more relevant in Deltarune than he was in Undertale, especially if he's going to come back and have some sort of purpose later. So keep that in mind. I have to keep saying that. And finally, Jevil says, unfortunately, you kids cannot have such a pleasant dream. From now, a nightmare will awaken in your hearts, in the shadow of the night's hand. So we can break this down, actually, pretty easily, I think. The shadow of the night's hand references the night creating a dark fountain. I think that's pretty obvious. A nightmare will awaken in your hearts. Hearts in Undertale are almost always associated with the soul, right? Because the soul is a heart. So a nightmare will awaken in your soul could be important, especially considering determination is needed to create dark fountains. And finally, the first line where it says, unfortunately, you kids cannot have such a pleasant dream. If we break that down, it seems like Jevil is saying, you kids cannot enjoy a perfect world in like a dark fountain because the night is going to constantly awaken this nightmare in your hearts, whatever that is supposed to mean. And that's interesting, because we see in Chapter 2 the sort of want for characters like Susie and Berdly to just create a perfect dark fountain that they can escape to. But Jevil here is saying that that will be impossible for them the way they are. And thankfully, that is the end of me just reading quotes to you. Or wait, is it? There's one more thing. If I'm going to look up dreams, I might as well look up wake/awake as well. Because it's the opposite. So, given that we have this whole struggle of light and dark hopes and dreams that's sort of presented in the legend, what would the opposite of dreams be presented as here? And just a little suspiciously, the two people who use wake the most are Toriel and Susie, the two people that are most invested in keeping Chris on the right path, at least it seems like at this point. Most of Toriel's usage of the word wake are not very significant, though, and the same is true of Susie. Toriel is essentially using it the most because they are she is constantly asking them to wake up so they can go to school. The only one that's slightly interesting, and it's something we already knew about Chris, but when you go in and out of the Dreamer house a whole bunch, I think in the end of Chapter 1, because you can't do it with Susie after Chapter 2, she says, perhaps you could use some of that energy to wake up on time? In reference to coming back in and out, and she says, should I install a revolving door for you? It's a little sassy, but it does lead us to definitely 100% know for a fact that Chris is not sleeping well, which we already kind of knew. I mean, Alphys says that they sleep in class a lot, and we sort of believed that the reason for that, or at least I think the general consensus, The reason for that was because Chris is doing shenanigans at night when they aren't being controlled by the soul, which we kind of see in Chapter 1, where they go and get the pie and potentially do other things during the night. And even in Chapter 2, I mean, they wake back up and then do the whole create a dark fountain thing. I think there's a possibility there could be something else there, though. Because when they are asleep, that is one of the only times they are free from our control. So their world of dreams is the only place where they really can be free. And yep, keep that in mind for later. Susie says it 4 times, and it's mostly to Noelle. The only time she's not saying it to Noelle is in the Lancer and Susie versus Ralsei and Chris battle, where Ralsei can use Lullaby and it puts Susie to sleep. But then when she wakes up from that stage, she says, "Yawn, I'm awake. Did I miss anything?" Probably not important. The only thing that's minorly important is they're the characters that use the word the most, and that's probably not important either. Chris uses wake twice. I think the first one is just a command to wake somebody up. I genuinely don't know. I could not find it. I'm using the Deltarune dialogue dump, which, if you don't know, it's basically just every line of dialogue in the game, and then it was up to me to figure out where they came from, and I did it for the most part, so be grateful for that. The second one is in reference to Birdley, when Birdley's been snowgraved, where if you check Birdley, it says he doesn't seem to be awake, which is slightly more significant, but not super significant. Again, we'll get back to it. Queen has 2 references to it, although it's in 1 sentence. In the same line where she says a darker, darker dream, she says, "Wake, no, she has already awakened too much," about Noelle and the Snowgrave route. That is interesting, though, because in the determination video, and this was the reason for it being on the homework section, one of the things that we concluded was that Noelle building up all that power, the reason why she didn't seem to be a good candidate for Queen to create dark fountains at the end of the Snowgrave route is because once she kills Birdley, she kind of snaps. You know what I mean? She snaps out of it completely and kind of shuts down. And an interesting thing that was brought up to me in the comments of a video before when I questioned that, like, shouldn't she be even stronger now that she's got all this power in terms of determination, is that she's essentially trusts herself less now. She's actually lost confidence in herself through this process. Right before she killed Birdley, she had the peak of confidence in herself that she's ever had, and maybe peak determination, let's say. But after killing Birdley and sort of snapping back to reality, she trusts herself even less now, especially with the Snowgrave route revealing that the whole thing was real in the end. It certainly seems like maybe she has lost a power. So it's interesting that Queen says she has awakened to something when she's gaining all this power, and she needs to go into a darker yet darker dream to sort of repair herself. It's a little weird. We'll get back to it. Let's get back to it counter. Let's not. Spampton has 1 use of the word wake, where he says, "The smooth taste of Neo. Wake up and taste the pain." Probably not relevant, but funny that he's in both sections. And finally, Noelle has 1 use where she says, "Okay, Susie, hit me with your axe and wake me up." Again, probably not relevant. In terms of dream being relevant versus wake being relevant, dream seems far more relevant. And really the only wake that seems to be relevant is Queen's line in referencing Noelle needing to go into a darker yet darker dream. So yeah, it was kind of a waste, but I did all the research, so I thought I'd present it to you anyway, in case anybody had any thoughts about that. So, with all that said, you've seen basically all my evidence. I want to present to you my theories. We've got to the theories part of the video. So, connotations theory. This was the theory I essentially composed in the Origins of Darkness video, which, in its most basic terms, connotation basically means the extra properties to an object that aren't its literal properties. To sort of explain that a bit more, the example I always use is rules card. So in Deltarune, rules card is literally a rules card. He's the card in a deck that tells you how to play games. But when we take rules into the dark world, he becomes an overly wordy and kind of pompous character, which, when you think of the rules card, those might be things that come to your mind, like, oh, it's using flowery language, and it's kind of overly wordy and hard to read. So my basis for the theory was essentially saying that the personalities of the Darkners are based on the way people see their object in that sort of symbolic sense. Which I put the connotation definition here because I wanted to make it a little bit more clear. In that original video, I didn't really, but there is multiple definitions of connotation, right? And the one I'm using more so is the second definition here, which says the signification of something, or in other words, its symbolic sort of meaning, like rose for love, or a heart for love, which is actually what Hathi seems to be based on. But if we add dreams into the mix and say the dark worlds are dream-like at this point, it adds an entire new layer to this connotations theory. So, psychology. I promise, I promise I will explain this to you in simple terms. I've in fact looked for articles that use pretty much plain terms, and I'm going to explain them to you anyway, so you can hopefully understand even if you don't really know all the background to this stuff. So I'm going to read a quote to you now. It's from an actual article about dreams and what we know about them, which surprisingly is actually very little. We don't really know why we have dreams at this point. There are hypotheses out there. I think the most popular one, at least it was when I was learning, was that dreams are meant to sort of prepare you for situations that may occur in your life. And because of that, this ends up being somewhat true. The continuity hypothesis states that a large majority of dreams, the exact percentage has not been yet established, this is what I'm talking about, express the same conceptions, for example, of oneself or specific relatives and friends, and personal concerns, such as relationships and avocations, that animate waking thought. Or, to sum it up, what happens in your regular life is what happens in your dreams, just to a sort of exaggerated level. And so when we're looking at something like connotations, which I did not go back to the connotation slide, when we're looking at something like connotations, the symbolic meaning of a thing, it's kind of an exaggerated version of what's happening in your life. Kind of. So when we talked about Queen, for example, she's kind of motherly, right? She's everybody's sort of mom. Or she seems to reference the relationships people have with their mother. She doesn't really understand Chris in the same way Toriel doesn't really understand Chris. She's very controlling of Noelle in the same way Noelle's mother is very controlling of her. Beyond that, it's a little bit hard to tell, but she ignores Birdley a lot, which Birdley seems like a kind of guy that gets ignored a lot, and seems to be very permissive with Susie, which might explain why she's so wild, let's say. But if that is the sort of ongoing thing in their normal life of these characters, and it is drawn into this dreamlike state and then manifests as Queen the character because she's a motherboard, it sort of adds a new layer to the whole connotations theory. Anyway, I have a little bit more to say about psychology. And here it is. So, what is happening? I hate this. Okay, there we go. It keeps going back to a different slide for me. So, dreams were thought to provide key insight into the collective unconscious. So I'm not going to read this whole quote. You can read the whole quote on the screen if you'd like. Basically, the collective unconscious is sort of a thought that, due to instincts developing for humans as we evolved a long, long time ago, those little parts of our instincts manifest in our dreams, which is why you have shared sort of experiences in dreams of something like, oh, I don't know, all your teeth falling out or falling down a big hole. And Carl Jung, who was the one who sort of proposed this mostly, Freud is also brought up in this, but it's mostly to contrast Jung's sort of view of it. And I don't like Freud, I'm just going to be honest. He was like the first guy, so most of his theories are just like, what if this was true? Without much evidence. Theories of psychology, not Deltarune, by the way. I don't think Freud knew what Deltarune was, but who knows? He smoked a lot of stuff, strong stuff. You might have imagined it. But what Jung is specifically saying is that a lot of these shared experiences that we have then manifest into similar dreams. And this is sort of an instinctual basis. And it's what we call the collective unconscious. So this is very interesting when it comes to Deltarune, because this is essentially the sort of mechanism through which connotation theory kind of makes sense in terms of being in the dark world. If the dark world is a projection of dreams, or dream-like in that sense, then it makes a lot of sense that these aspects of the collective unconscious, these base instincts, and also what we were talking about before with the continuity hypothesis would apply, which is why we would see darkeners like Queen start to manifest that seem to directly reflect a person in a specific character's life. And it sort of puts the bottle cap on the connotations theory, because now it's not just sort of like Toby having fun with designing characters. Now it actually says something about what the dark worlds are. They are dreamlike, or literally dreams, because when we exit the dark world, we wake up. Now, I don't think the dark world events are fake. I think that would be kind of stupid at this point, because we literally carry things from the dark world into the real world, and they are consistent in multiple places. Like Lancer's characterization is consistent in different dark fountains. It seems like we are accessing this sort of subconscious world by entering the dark world. In other words, we're all having like a swamp gas shared fugue state fever dream, which kind of makes sense, right? So to continue, now I have to talk to you about philosophy. So that was basically the end of Dark Worlds or Dreams talk. Again, we'll get back to it in the conclusion. Now I want to talk about why. Why are we doing this from like a storytelling sense? Because it's fun, right? Like, oh, the Dark Worlds are like, we're exploring like the mental states of the characters through this dream-like continuity, and the other term that I just read you a whole thing about, collective unconscious. But why? And here is why. So I will say you should probably look at the screen for this, just to see this diagram while I go through it. This is Plato's, yes, Plato. I'm quoting Plato at you in a Deltarune theory. I'm sorry, but it's something I gotta do. This is Plato's allegory of the cave. So to briefly go over it, on the left you see these like shackled people. Plato said, if these shackled people had lived their entire lives in this cave, and then they see these shadows being cast on the cave wall by these people in front of the large torch, the shadows to them are reality. They've never seen a real dog or a real horse, but to them, they know the shadow on the wall as a horse. To them, that's all a horse is. But once they are freed from those shackles and exit the cave and can see a real horse, then they are getting to the true meaning of what a horse is. And the reason why Plato was using this complicated sort of metaphor is he was basically arguing for logic versus emotion. It was that kind of a time. To Plato, emotion is this unrefined form of reality. By just trusting exactly what our senses tell us and not thinking more critically, we are essentially like being shackled to this cave and looking at the cave wall. We aren't seeking the true meaning of a thing. And then by using logic, we can leave the cave and exit into the light, and well, then we can see the true reality of what's going on around us. Why am I telling you this in terms of Deltarune? Well, let me read you this quote from Spampton G. Spampton, famous Deltarune character. So big we'll stand up tall and see past the dark, stand up with our heads in the clouds and look into heaven. This diagram that I've pulled for the allegory of the cave, this is the Wikipedia diagram for it. So this is widely available to everyone. And not only are they quite literally seeing past the dark in terms of they're not looking at the shadows anymore. They are then walking out of the cave and looking into the clouds and the sun. But there's more to it than that, because what is a darkner? I had to do the impression at some point. I put the Dracula thing at the front of the video. It is essentially a shadow on the wall of a real object. We have the rules card, and the shadow version of rules card is rules card, this wordy puzzle master. The true reality then would be the actual rules card that we can hold. But I don't think that's it. And we'll get back to this later. But for now, just know that with this allegory of the cave thing, darkners are like the shadows on the wall. They are not true reality, but to them, that is all that is true. And so if we take a darkner out of the cave, in other words, take a darkner out of the dark world and they could survive and see the light world, they would then understand true reality. At least to them, or to us, our reality. Lightner's reality, maybe I should say, and be more specific. So, this says conclusions, but it's going to take me a while to get through them, so strap in. This is the final part of the video, where everything comes together. So, to start out with Hypothesis 1, there are essentially 3 hypotheses here with this information. Hypothesis 1. The dark worlds may be informed by the dreams of lightners that are there when they form, or that are there when they that enter the dark world, essentially. And the evidence for this is all those quotes where people compare being in the dark world to a dream, as well as the sort of psychology I quoted at you. The continuity hypothesis seems to make sense with characters like Queen, and maybe even somebody like Lancer, or to a further extent, Ralsei. Also, there's a lot of dream-like logic in the Dark Worlds. For example, the moon in Chapter 2 is a baseball. Nobody ever brings it up. The Ferris wheel in Chapter 2 not only moves them from place to place, but it displaces them in a way that should be impossible, Susie and Noelle. Because if we actually walk back through Queen's mansion, it doesn't really, like, track that they went from Noelle's room to the Queen stage in that way. Also, very dreamlike, is time is very wonky in the Dark World. We spend like a whole day adventuring in Chapter 1, and it's been like a couple hours when we get out of the Dark World. Wacky time displacement is a very dreamlike thing. So I think, even if the Dark Worlds aren't literally the projections of a Lightner's dream, they are, for our intents and purposes, dream-like enough to sort of apply some of these hypotheses to them. And that adds an interesting wrinkle when it comes to the allegory of the cave. So, in Chapter 1, just to cover this second point and then lead into the third one that's on the slide, in Chapter 1, we have a lot of stuff that seems like old people stuff. We have Cootie, which is this really old game where basically you're assembling a bug. And in Deltarune, it's represented by this worm, right? The worm that eats the leaves off a tree. And interestingly, despite the game being like about assembling this worm, there's nothing about assembling the worm in the Dark World character. The worm is just the worm. Similarly, the jack and ball that you play jacks with in the Dark World manifest as a coat hanger and just a little ball. And you think if the person who was doing this, if the connotations around it were that they often played jacks, then they would know what jacks was. And so drawing from that knowledge, they would actually sort of have a sort of thing about jacks. Like maybe the ball is constantly being tossed high up in the air and the little jack clothes hanger guy is trying to catch it. But that's not really what happens. So it could be that essentially the knight's dreams are mostly unfiltered in Chapter 1, until Susie and Chris enter the scene. And now things that originally would have had more significance are sort of watered down to their base form, because Susie and Chris don't have any sort of reference for that. Most interestingly, in Chapter 1, though, we have Sham, right? And in the original Origins of Darkness videos, I said, I don't know what Sham's real deal is. Like, we can get that maybe Sham has this nihilism going on because they're damaged, like they've got an eye broken off of them. And they're old because they're kind of just an old toy, right? They kind of have that old vibe to them. But stuff like being a item seller, like a shop owner, or being a wizard, which it seems like Sham was at some point, are totally, like, not connected to him being a little stuffed cat at all. However, if the knight, say, was someone who went through this classroom and played with these toys, then perhaps, and a lot of people in the comments of that video said this, but now I can really believe it because it's the sort of continuity hypothesis taking effect, the roles and characters that the knight has given to these toys are now actually manifesting in their personalities, because to them, those connotations are added on. And I just think that's very fun, because that means a character like Sham, or a character like maybe even Jevil, is giving us an insight into the knight's struggles and personalities. And what's Sham's biggest struggle? Sham is nihilistic and doesn't believe the world can be saved. So perhaps the knight is the same way. And I know, I don't know, I guess, but I feel strongly that this is true, because in Chapter 2, so much is influenced by Noelle and Birdley, and they were the ones who were in the Dark World first, with the knight, presumably. And there's so many things that reference Noelle's blog posts we got from the sweepstakes, like the plugs smiling, and the secret hidden rooms and stuff like that. And there's so much that reference what Birdley apparently wants, which is Smart Boy Theme Park. You know, we have the roller coaster, we have the Ferris wheel, we have all these gamer references like Hacker Man and all that stuff. But interestingly, when it comes to that sort of level, when it comes to the continuity hypothesis, we also have all these carnival games, which show up in Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. We have the little food stalls in Chapter 1, for one. But Jevil has the whole carousel, right? Which seems a little weird. Like, yeah, he's a clown, but it doesn't necessarily immediately make me think of carousels, of all things. And then in Chapter 2, we have, like I said, the roller coaster, the Ferris wheel, but we also have the teacup rides. And perhaps because the festival is coming up and the whole town is going to turn into a carnival, which is like a quote from the game, this is in the collective unconscious of everyone in town. They're all thinking about this festival that's coming up in the background of their day-to-day lives. And so that's why that seems to be manifesting in the Dark World over and over. Just a little more evidence for you. Hello there. As always with a video of this size, there's inevitably going to be some stuff I think of right after the fact or realize that I forgot. So while we're on the topic of collective unconscious, let me get back to Icy, which I totally forgot to do. Icy mentioning dreams doesn't seem very relevant until you realize that Icy is this huge brand that has everything from deodorant to food to these weird magazines. And even a character like Noelle has a whole backstory thinking Icy is some creepy monster, right? So it's fair to say, I think, at least in this small town, that Icy perhaps has entered into the collective unconscious. And in additional evidence to that, what is the character from Deltarune that would represent the collective unconscious the most? Well, it would have to be Everyman, right? And Everyman seems to show up a lot more in Deltarune than he did in Undertale. The only place that he shows up in Undertale is with the Amalgamates. And that was a case of a bunch of just sort of normal enemies fused together. So Everyman was meant to represent a collective consciousness in that case. Just a little bit of extra spice for your spicy pepperoni Chiaz pizza. Feel free to continue. The legend, I already mentioned a couple times the, story of light and dark, hopes and dreams. Where did the legend come from? We don't really know. Ralsei just says, oh, it's a legend I heard, basically. I'm going to read it to you. What if the legend 2 is based on a collective unconscious, or something from the collective unconscious, to be a little bit more grammatically correct? Gerson says that his story was written a lot based on dreams. And there's also a lot of parallels drawn between Gerson and Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And originally The Hobbit was a story that Tolkien told to his children. In the same way, it's implied that Gerson's Lord of the Hammer books, which, wow, I can't believe it's a reference, were also started as stories for children. I think it's quite possible that the Lord of the Hammer series could perhaps involve some of the characters we've seen in sort of a diluted way. Like, Shaw might be a character in Lord of the Hammer, because it's a toy that Gerson's children might have played with. And I know I'm really going hard on, I think Alvin's the knight at this point, but I think it's something interesting to keep in mind, because that might mean that the legend is based as well on the Lord of the Hammer books. It's like the plot summary that everyone sort of has in their collective unconscious about this series. And if that is true, then Ralsei's entire purpose is based on a book series that is it's fictional. It's entirely fiction. And I think that might explain some of his weird behaviors, maybe. So I just wanted to bring it up. Also, Chapter 3, the reason why I'm bringing this up is that in Chapter 3, Chris makes the Dark Fountain with Susie and Toriel already asleep. They're already dreaming. So I think we will know for sure whether this theory holds weight when we go into Chapter 3. And if the Dark World seems really influenced by Toriel and Susie, it's a lock, basically. Because they're the ones that are here while the Dark Fountain's being created. Their dreams should manifest the most in this Dark World, which basically means if we see a bunch of giant monster movies, if we see Susie maybe feeling like, she wants to bring her friends to the real world, that kind of a thing. If we see Toriel being scared of somebody who might be stalking around, like the person that just slashed her tires, that'll basically confirm it. So basically what I'm saying is, when Chapter 3 comes out, keep me in mind if you'd like. Now let's get to some real juicy stuff. Imagination. So this is why I said you should remember the swatch quotes in reference to the Neo body. Because in the original connotations theory, I said it was interesting that the Neo body manifests as a Dark World object, but doesn't, become alive. You know what I mean? And similarly, another piece of art that was drawn, it's a picture of Gerson that's on the wall in Chapter 1's Dark Fountain room, also doesn't seem to come as a Darkner. A lot of people suggested that maybe he's just in a place we can't see him, but then why would Toby include that? Just for fun? It seems a little weird. However, I think now that we have this whole allegory of the cave thing to think about, I think it actually makes a lot of sense, and here's why. If Darkners are the shadows on the wall, they need something for the shadow to be cast from. In other words, you need to be able to have the rules card in order to cast these sort of shadows on the wall that become the Darkners. The Neo body does not have a real world equal in Deltarune. The real world, or the real world, the Neo body is entirely something that was imagined. And that, my friends, opens up a large hole that we are going to jump into. What happens if the shadow being cast on the wall comes from something that has no object in the light world? You could perhaps say that it is a darker yet darker shadow. It has no light world alternative. There is no mixture of light and dark. It is just dark. So now let's go to the real bonkers part, and the reason why I made that little community post before I posted this, that I really think I've solved Deltarune. And here it is. So, on screen right now I have the allegory of the cave, but inverted. What does that mean? Well, we've always been trying to figure out what dark, darker, yet darker means, right? Because it's just kind of a quote, but Gaster ends up saying it a lot. And we know Gaster is involved in Deltarune in some capacity, because the whole Goner Maker sequence at the beginning of the game that plays another hymn, which is just basically an interpolation of Gaster's theme. I think I understand what Gaster's motivation is. I think I understand it, and it's a little bit crazy. So, just to go through it very quickly again, the allegory of the cave is basically saying that these shadows on the wall of the cave that these prisoners see are their reality. But by entering into the light, by leaving the cave, they can see true reality. But in the world of Deltarune, that's not true reality, is it? The light world in Deltarune is just part of the game. And we know Gaster knows he's in a game because he's talked to us on Twitter. So, for Gaster, going to the light world isn't a priority. And I think it's interesting that we have this sort of juxtaposition between Spamton and Jevil, where Spamton really wants to gain enough power to see past the dark. So maybe when he gets the Neo body, he can actually see into the light world with the Shadow Crystal, right? But that doesn't actually bring him peace of mind, because when he sees into the light world, it's just another layer of darkness. A darker, darker layer, you could say. So what can Gaster do? Because no matter what, Gaster and the Gaster followers, being Jevil and Spamton, let's say, they can't ascend to our reality. So what is their option? Well, they can instead descend deeper into darkness. Let's look at the allegory of the cave and say that the fire was put out. So now there are no shadows on the wall. And also, let's say there's no natural light filtering in, which it seems like there would be from this picture, but there isn't, okay? Now it is complete pitch darkness. There is nothing. Then what becomes reality? Your own mind is basically what reality becomes. Whatever you imagine becomes your reality. So let's say you feel a weird rock on the cave floor, and you imagine it's this like weird creature, because it kind of feels like it scuttles a bit, even though it's just a rock, right? That is now your reality. You think there is a little scuttling creature around in the cave somewhere, because it's pitch black, and you can't understand anything else other than what your own mind can create. And in that way, you can find freedom despite being a game character. You can't reach the true level of seeing the true world and being free to make your own choices. But if you descend the world into darker and darker darkness, eventually you can get to the point where everything is real. And therefore, your choices finally matter, which is basically what the point of this is. Because if you are trapped in this sort of cycle of never being able to reach the outside of the cave, nothing you do is ever real, right? It's all just shadows on the wall. But if you step back instead and make the entire thing darkness, and now whatever you think of can be real, you're finally free. Because anything you think of is your reality. And you can basically do whatever you want, as long as you can think of it. So you're still chained a little bit, but I think it's very interesting that it seems to kind of just make sense. And this is what I mean when I made that community post and I said, I've stumbled into some terrible truth. Because I just thought, what would happen if you reverse the allegory of the cave? And suddenly everything was darkness. And I thought, well, anything you imagine becomes reality. And I think that's what a character like Jevil or a character like Gaster really wants, is the complete abandonment of the light world. And even an abandonment of the dark world, which is kind of what the Roaring seems like, right? The entire world is covered in darkness. The Darkners can't survive because there's no light essentially casting shadows on the wall anymore. They're no longer real. And the light world crumbles into this fully dark state. I think that's what the roaring is. It's this extreme darkness that causes anything to be real. To add another level onto it, Gaster was shattered across time and space, right? This is the sort of thing that we know about him from the Goners. A way you could interpret that is that Gaster has been lost into the collective unconscious, which sort of spans time and space. It's something that is always with us, essentially. For example, let's say that Alphys actually did work with Gaster. We don't know this is true. But in that timeline, Alphys would have known some things about Gaster, like his professional scientific side. And let's say, for example, that Sans really was Gaster's son or relative of some way. Then Sans knows another side of Gaster. He knows that sort of familial side to Gaster. And let's say the Gaster followers now know this new side of Gaster, this sort of shattered across phantom that shows up every now and again. That is another part of Gaster. So, if we can unite all those collective unconscious memories of Gaster together, Gaster can finally be real again. In the only sense that's possible at this point. By bringing together all these little pieces of him that are lodged in people's memories, he can become a true being again. And that is the most crazy thing I've ever said in a Deltarune theory. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was at least thought-provoking if it didn't convince you of anything. But I really think that's what Darker Yet Darker might be in reference to. The shadows keep growing, the darkness cutting deeper. The other thing I want to quickly add that I kind of got caught up in the whole Gaster thing and almost forgot is that a lot of people have said that Ralsei is kind of like Chris's dreamer Sona. Like, they've got the pinkish horns from the headband that Chris used to wear. Obviously, they are a goat. Ralsei is a goat. And has the sort of dreamer-ish personality traits. Like, oh, they're so kind, and they have healing magic, and that kind of thing. It's very possible, I think, that Ralsei could also be a being of imagination, which puts him at this Darker Yet Darker level, right? Because that means that he's not really represented by anything in the light world either, just like the Neo body. The horns might cast a shadow, but the shadow it casts is not Ralsei, is basically what I'm saying. If the horns is the item that represents him, it is not the entirety of his essence. I think that it also comes from the imagination of Chris. Which kind of makes him not a Darkner, right? He's kind of a Darkner, but he's a little bit more of a thing than a Darkner. Which might be why he's never called a Darkner in the game. He's called a Prince from the Dark and all of this stuff. Because he's not a Darkner. He's this Darker Yet Darker being. Which I'm sure will never come into any level of importance in the story ever. Okay, now I'm really done. How long was I recording for, by the way? How long is this video? Oh, it's almost an hour. Well, it's actually not... I thought I was going to be over an hour, to be honest. I hope you enjoyed. Like and subscribe if you did. Leave a comment if you've got any thoughts. As always with these videos, it's very possible that I've missed something that might help or hinder this group of theories at this point, basically. And yeah, let me know what you thought. I'd be very curious to see, because I feel like I've gone insane and reached a level of enlightenment that I never thought possible. So, yeah. I don't really have anything else to say. That's the end of the video. So, boo, it's Gaster. Ah, everything is Gaster. Run!